on expanding renewable and DR market development at the wholesale level. So shifting gears just a little bit here. So now achieving the New York REV targets for renewable generation and greenhouse gas emissions reductions requires a swift uptake of both bulk power renewables and distributed energy resources, right? So bringing these resources online and in a timely fashion requires a market structure that can absorb a rapidly evolving resource mix with an economic business case. So I'd like to welcome Michael DeSocio, the Senior Manager of Market Design from the New York Independent System Operator, Melissa Kemp, the Director of Policy at Cypress Creek Renewables, and John Moran, Project Manager at sPower. So to get us started here, Michael, I'm going to look at you to take the pulse on where we are with the integration of renewables and DERs at the wholesale level in New York.
Sure. First of all, thank you all for having me. This is my first GTM event, and it's been fantastic so far. But just kind of laying out where we're at from a wholesale perspective and what the state is trying to accomplish, we are really focused on how can we get the most value out of these renewable resources possible. So we're not new to renewable resources. We've been installing and building renewable resources for the last 10 years or so. And as we've done that, we've learned a lot of things. We've pioneered market structures that have really enabled those renewable resources to really enter the marketplace and engage and reap the value of the wholesale markets. And by doing that, what we're doing is making sure that that plant that gets installed, we maximize the use of it. We use it in times where normally we would want to go fire up a gas turbine. To the extent that renewable resource is online, we can use that instead. But renewable resources are variable, and that presents a pretty big challenge to the grid. And from a grid operator perspective, that's what the ISO's main responsibility is. And we facilitate wholesale markets to support the reliable operation of the grid. What we're trying to do is make sure those market signals incent resources to locate where there's the most value, as well as follow operator instructions when we need them to. And back in 2009, we came up with a wind on dispatch program because we needed that wind to follow grid operations instructions. And we learned a lot from that. And as we've done that, we see adding all this renewable that the state is anticipating bringing online, we're already a step ahead of doing that. But the story is not ending there. We need a lot of transmission. Most of the renewable-rich areas of the state are north and west of the load centers, and we just don't have enough transmission to deliver all of that green energy, clean energy to the load centers, to New York City. And so we're going to need to build out some transmission. In our power trends, we talked about what happened in 2016. In 2016, 85% of the energy delivered in the north and west of the state, upstate New York, was clean already. But in downstate, 75% of the energy delivered was from fossil fuels. And that's a tale of two grids. And what we need to do is we need to build enough transmission to bring those grids together and maximize the value of these resources.
Great, thanks so much. And from our renewable providers here, what is it that's making New York attractive for you guys? John, maybe you can get us started.
Sure. So from sPower's perspective, we've most of our utility scale projects, most of our projects in New York are on Long Island. So they've had RFPs and they had a feed-in tariff. As a developer owner, you want certainty of revenue over a 15 or 20-year period. And LIPE has provided that for us. So I think from our perspective, when you're looking at modeling a project, you want to be able to predict the revenues. And we've been active in other states in the past, whether it was New Jersey or Massachusetts with SRECs. From our perspective, if we can get a 20-year contract from a counterparty like LIPA, that's great credit, and we'll do those projects all day long. What we're seeing in other parts of the country is you're seeing the corporate off-takers now and community choice aggregators. Upstate New York, I think the problem has been that the wholesale price of electricity is pretty low, and you're competing against hydro and wind. So developing solar upstate has been a challenge, but I've noticed in the New York ISO queue, there's a lot of new projects in the queue. So I think that development's starting to take place, and trying to develop the markets now.
Great, Melissa?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think John's right that we're finally seeing a potential opening here for some serious scaling of solar and storage. That's what, what we focus on, for example, in New York. I think the big thing that's changed is we had an energy commodity value capacity still being worked on, but we didn't have any kind of environmental placeholder. And so with the advent of, we did have a previous RPS that was somewhat voluntary, but now with more of a mandate, we have a larger procurement for that new clean energy standard, which means that we have ongoing procurements currently, right? NYSERDA's procurement just closed last week, NYPA's closed a few weeks before that, which is stimulating the opportunity to get to a revenue stream that makes sense for 20 megawatt to 100 plus megawatt projects. I think the devil will be in the details, right? What is that ramp rate if we're sticking with the CES? Where are those REC requirements for the distribution utilities and LSEs going? If we're really switching to carbon pricing or blending in carbon pricing in the wholesale market, what's that value going to be? How's that going to work? How much can we see out? I think, as you just mentioned, some level of predictability is very important. Development cycles are long, permitting, siting processes are long. So the sooner that we can get some clarity about how exactly this is headed and we see the results of these first 2 rounds of procurements this year, I think will tell us a lot about where we're headed.
Great. Yeah, and then let's see. The ISO has recently put out a roadmap in addition to a study looking at carbon pricing. So how are you helping these folks better access your markets?
We're doing everything we can, and we're here to listen and hear what the challenges are. Because we have a lot of resources. I don't know if everybody knows what the ISO does, but what our role is to bring value to customers and make sure we do so in a way that's as cost effective as possible. And a couple of ways we're doing that is to try to provide some guidance on what our view is of some of the future. We released earlier this year a distributed energy resources roadmap, which really lays out the next 5 years of work that the ISO anticipates undertaking to really develop a framework for bringing DER into the wholesale market in as efficient a way as possible, to eliminate the barriers, get that participation introduced into the wholesale market, increase that value stream for them, and in doing so, open up opportunities for third parties. We can't do this by ourselves. The ISO sees all the way to the edge of the transmission system, and then we stop. We don't have visibility down into the distribution networks. That's what the utilities' role is. And so we're going to need help to get visibility on what these DERs can do. And so our model is an aggregation model. Have a third party or a DSP aggregate these DERs and bring that value to the wholesale market. And we're just working through the rules as we speak. I have a couple of really exciting announcements coming up. At the end of this week, we have a workshop really working through a lot of the details on how that model might work. And then on October 20th, we're going to announce the opening of a pilot program. So this is kind of along the theme of we need to also learn by doing. To the extent there's a lot of distributed resources out there, we need to understand what they're capable of and what they're not, and work with them on things like communication paths and metering, and can they follow a signal on a 5-minute basis, or can they follow a signal on a 6-second basis? All of those things we need to test and verify and understand, because that will change how the model evolves. The other thing we've done recently through the Brattle Group is we worked with the Brattle Group to think about how can we help achieve the 50% goal through the wholesale market more directly. And we thought about carbon pricing. What would happen if we took the value of carbon emissions and we added that as a cost to dispatching a carbon emitting resource? Well, that's going to change the dispatch model. That's also going to change the price signals. That will create more incentive for clean resources to locate where we need them the most, which may ultimately obviate some of the need for some transmission build, because we'll actually get the resources built where the load centers are, where we need carbon-free resources to locate. And we're in the beginning phases of that process. There's a lot of work to be done, but we're very excited about where that's headed.
Great.
I was just going to clarify in case there was any confusion. Just in our minds, like the DER roadmap is really interesting, but it is distinct from what we were talking about before that, and what I think we just circled back to with the carbon pricing, in the sense that there are changes happening to support utility scale projects, right? And in the normal market functions. And then there's the question for DERs, like can they provide additional value by participating in that market as well through some type of aggregation? And I know it was one of the questions I think maybe you hope to tease out eventually, is like, what do we see for those of us who have large pipelines of DERs, solar plus storage, others? Do we, what's the perspective right now on that roadmap for them? I think it's a really interesting idea. I think the challenge is you have a tariff-based system, right, with the value of DER tariff that was mentioned earlier, that's kind of passing through a very initial, low step, some signals from the NYISO. And so when you're looking at it, when you have a DER project pipeline, having a tariff for 20 years with a much higher value is obviously going to be an attractive path, rather than bidding in services into the NYISO. But perhaps there are opportunities for ancillary services or other things that we could take advantage of. And then you have things like, I think, the non-wire alternatives, which are really interesting, where those are a contract process, it's not a tariff. So if I'm not being used by the utility for certain times of day, perhaps there are services I could provide to the transmission wholesale bulk system. So point being, though, just to be clear that there are two distinct issues, right? How do we make wholesale markets function really well for the integration of larger scale renewable assets? And then how are we dealing with the aggregation of DERs if there is a need to see them or a need for them or ability for them to get additional value streams or provide value to the system?
Yeah, John, maybe you have some comments on what your value stack looks like in this
Well,
space.
I think from, when you look at, does it pencil in upstate New York at this point, now we're getting closer to it because the prices dropped so much. So, I talk to other developers and I see them in the pipeline. I start talking about them. How are you going to do this? How, whether they're responding to the NYSERDA RFP or the NYPA RFP, and what they think the value of the RECs will be. The solar resource is not as good up there, but the price now you can install, we'll see what happens with the tariff, but you were talking about sub $1 a watt installs. I think at that point maybe it was getting close to where you didn't need a specific carve out for solar, and you might be able to make it work in certain areas of the state. I think at this point, what I've experienced on Long Island, and we have some utility scale projects, is the interconnection process with the New York ISO is, it's a 2-year process. So for folks out there who are going to develop these large projects in New York State, and once you go over 25 megawatts in New York State, you get into an Article 10 process, which is a 2-year permitting process. So the authority having jurisdiction at that point is the state. So just so everyone's aware, when you are siting these projects and looking at the different substations and the different land, just be aware that get your marker in there if you are serious about developing, because it's a long process and you got to stick with it. And I think the other thing I found out is there's we have the value stack on that side, but on the operation side is the expense side is the property taxes. And what I've found on Long Island are there's technically it's property tax exempt. You go to the local assessor and you work out a pilot payment with them, and that could be a very large line item on a project in New York State, especially in Suffolk County. I've found that unless you get that nailed down, it can really hurt the returns on your project.
Yeah, I have to ask one question that just came up here now. No one's talked about the Suniva filing so far and how that's impacting you guys' business cases right now. I know the ruling will come soon, but it's causing a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, no, I think supply and demand. There's the prices a few months ago were in the 30s, and now they're in the mid to high 40s. People are trying to get panels in before get them in before there is a potential tariff. So I have a project next year, 20 megawatt project that'll be built on Long Island, and we already bought the panels, and it was at a higher price than we had anticipated, but we wanted to get them in and make sure that we had them before any potential tariff and had certainty on what the price would be. So. It's a big question mark. We're in that process now, and hopefully, we can make a case where there'll be low to, maybe no tariffs even. We'll see.
Yeah, I don't think we should spend that much time on that here. I think it's an industry-wide issue. I think the industry is taking a lot of precautions and planning a great deal to avoid worst-case outcomes with the trade case. And I think that this needs to continue across the Northeast. Utility-scale solar, wholesale market integration of utility-scale solar and storage and DERs is going to continue regardless. So yeah, there's all sorts of wonderful talent and time and money going into how do we succeed in the next month, right, or 2 months in having a reasonable outcome to that trade situation. But I don't think the real challenges we have are in how we're structuring these markets and how we're choosing to bring about internalize the value of dealing with climate change, and whether it's in the wholesale market price, whether it's through RPSs and CESs, and RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, being extended for another period of time. How do all these pieces fit together? How do we send a clear signal to the market that the market can respond to and plan for? And how do we are all on the same page about we're getting it's a fair value and a fair trade for residents and ratepayers?
Yep. Michael, I have a question for you, right? So when I look at other ISOs, I'm going to use PJM as an example, right? I think everyone likes to talk about PJM, right? So, around 2015 is when regulation picked up a lot of storage, picked up a lot of water heaters, and, that kind of is where a lot of people thought they would make their money. And now people have made investments and people are starting to pull out of there. So how are you going to kind of hedge for that in the New York ISO markets? Like, I know last year, for instance, I had a panelist up here, storage vendor, and they said, we pulled out of New York, but we want to come back, but we're not seeing it there yet.
That's a great question. So I would say we're in a great position to accommodate as much storage as the market will bear. And I'll say that because our design in New York is very different than what PJM built. And so the design we put in place in 2009 and then expanded it through the pay for performance order from FERC really focuses on maximizing the value of the storage asset by managing state of charge. It is not providing a uniform regulation signal like what PJM did. And what that means from the ISO's perspective is we won't find ourselves in a situation where we're running out of the regulation service we need, because we will make sure we deploy the assets that we need to meet the regulation needs. But I'm going to put that in perspective. The regulation market is a fairly small market in New York. Roughly the wholesale sales on an annual basis are about $8 billion, and the regulation market is about 20 to 25 million of that. So it's very small. And when we talk about capacity-wise, the size of the ISO capacity needs is roughly 40,000 megawatts. We procure on a daily basis between 150 to 300 megawatts of regulation service, but that's in today's terms. I want to say that regulation isn't valuable, and I certainly believe that it's going to become more valuable. So what I mean by that is, as we add more variable resources on the system, we're going to need more flexible resources that can provide regulation service to balance the variable nature of solar and wind. And so as we see more of that penetration, we expect that regulation needs will go up, and that 150 megawatts to 300 megawatts we would expect to go up. We are in the middle of studying that. So the ISO is taking on a study, really thinking about what happens when we get to a place where 50% of the energy served to the whole state is renewable and intermittent. And through that study, we hope to understand whether or not we need a flexible ramping product, whether we need more regulation service, whether we need to separate out the regulation up from the regulation down, things that California's already had to deal with because they've already had those kind of penetrations that we haven't had. So we're thinking about it, we're talking about it, and we encourage all of your feedback on that. The more minds on this, the better off we're all going to be.
Yeah, and Melissa and John, what conversations are you having, if any, with other DR providers, specifically storage, I would say?
I think, in New York and across the country, we're looking at our portfolio of projects and we're building them now to be either built with storage or to be retrofitted in the future with storage. So we're seeing the price of batteries come down rapidly, and I think it's a natural thing for an intermittent resource like wind and solar to have batteries with them. And as the price comes down, it's something that we're planning on.
Yeah, we're in the same position. We have about 1 gigawatt of solar deployed across the country and a couple more gigs in the pipeline. A lot of that, a growing portion of that has storage. In New York in particular, it's been starting to work through the interconnection nuts and bolts in terms of how these projects are, when they're co-located, how are they studied independently, together, one point of all sorts of boring stuff that we probably don't want to talk about here. But there's a lot of just devil in the details, and it's the first time some of this is being done. So there's been a big effort to work closely with New York ISO and figure some of those things out. And then that just comes back to the revenue stream, like just making sure that that is a fair revenue stream and that that is something that is predictable. It doesn't have to be fixed, it's not going to be fixed, but something that we can actually predict and model and therefore move projects forward with.
Yeah, Melissa, can you just talk a little bit about your experience outside of New York, right, and working within another market that's in a wholesale footprint?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, Cypress Creek in particular, we've done work in PJM, we've done work in ERCOT, we've done work in SPP, but really actually most of our utility development to date has been in the regulated states, which is an interesting, things there. They have other challenges, but in terms of revenue, it is somewhat straightforward. You're typically selling everything for a fixed or fixed with escalating price going forward. So in revenue, it's a simpler question. In the other wholesale markets, we are having similar types of experiences as they start to actually get into the nuts and bolts of how to do this. But most of our utility scale stuff is in the regulated states to date.
Great.
And California, which is obviously a mix
so
of.
you can get those PERPA contracts. I know you guys are very active, have been very active in North Carolina.
Right.
So you could either, you've been getting PERPA contracts, or in California through the RPS, you were getting contracts from the utilities. Now corporate buyers are coming in, so you're seeing in PGM where you can, site something near a data center and you sell it into the wholesale market, and the corporate off-taker, you'll do a contract for differences. And then the other model is the community choice aggregators. So Moran Clean Energy, for example, in California. And I'd like to see that model come into New York as well, so where you can get closer to a retail rate for some of these renewable resources, people will be willing to pay for it.
Yeah, I think I'm going to try and incorporate a question here from the audience. And, for the developers on stage, what size solar should we be looking at as kind of a sweet spot?
I mean, we would say, if you're talking, utility scale market, not aggregation, we're talking, 20 megawatts and over is typically, and I would expect in the Northeast, typically we won't, who knows, but we probably won't see a lot bigger than 100 and change. It depends. We don't have big deserts to fill. So at least initially, what we're seeing both in the queue and in New England ISO and otherwhere is 20 to 100 megawatts AC as kind of being a typical starting size for this market to scale.
Yeah, and I think, I mentioned before that once you go over 25 megawatts in New York, you have to go through that Article 10 process. I think the small generation interconnection agreements for 20 megawatts, I think there's certain things maybe you could line those up, maybe make them both 25. And maybe look at the Article 10 process, and for, I know with wind you had like a 5-mile radius. We're the second project going through the Article 10 process in New York. There's one in front of us. They got the radius down to 1 mile for solar because it's not as visible. So maybe there's a way we can work with the PSC and kind of expedite the Article 10 process for, a certain size, up to a certain, maybe a larger size of solar. Maybe you don't hit that mark at 25. So yeah, I think, here land is more expensive, and there's not as much of it. So you're not going to see maybe the huge utility scale stuff. But I think it's easier to get things permitted and get things interconnected at the smaller scale. It's it's still a fairly long cycle, but you can get it done in a couple of years.
Right, and how would maybe this is for you? It's another question that came in is how would carbon pricing impact C&I projects?
That's a good question. I guess I see the carbon pricing proposal or concept that we're talking about. I wouldn't say it's a proposal yet, but certainly we're digging into the details. I see that as complementing the other values that are out there. So certainly as we add a carbon price to the wholesale market energy price, the LBMP, that may diminish the need for RECs at the rate we pay for RECs. But you probably still need a REC. And then to the extent that the retail rate, the value of DER, has a environmental attribute as part of it, we need to remember that the LBMP will be part of that retail rate, and so we'll have to think about whether that environmental portion of the rate needs to be adjusted. So there's a lot of pieces here, and it's hard to predict. What I would offer is it is a clearer way for C&I to understand ultimately what they're going to be required to deal with from a cost perspective. By putting it in the price, it'll be very transparent what that value is and how to hedge it. You can hedge it now with normal wholesale market hedging tools, and that's a lot of the benefit that could come out of doing something like that. The other thing is it provides a very acute market and price signal as to the times of the day and the locations on the grid where that value is the highest. And so to the extent we want to try to minimize the amount of resources we need to go build to achieve the 50% goal, we see this as a great tool to get us there. I would offer that, when I say that, I mean that seriously, because what we're estimating is roughly needing to build between 15,000 and 17,000 megawatts of renewable resources to meet that goal with the current projections we have out into 2030. So when we talk about what kind of scale do we need to build resources at, as much as small scale seems to be easier at the moment, we need to figure out a way to quickly build some larger scale resources to get to that goal.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, and I think that number is even bigger if it depends on what your mix of solar and wind and hydro is.
That's exactly
so
true.
If you have more solar in there, then the number is a bit larger from a nameplate point of view. But I would just add that with the carbon pricing thing, I mean, I think he's absolutely right. I would say that the number that's arrived at, obviously there's a starting number in the kind of initial discovery report on it from Brattle, but like what that value is, I think would influence C&I development more than anything else, right? I mean, C&I has a proxy starting value for environmental, the REC price from last year for projects going forward under the value of DER tariff. So starting place is pretty low. So, what ends up happening with the stakeholder process and what that value should be, I think would probably be one of the single biggest impacts on that particular market.
Yeah, shifting gears a little bit, bigger picture. What are the big priorities for you in this REV environment? John, maybe you can get us started.
Well, I think we see New York as an opportunity. I know there are 3 Mile Island's set to shut down. There's 2 nuclear plants upstate that are getting these zero emission credits. So, I think we're kind of taking a wait and see approach for now. Like I said, we've been active on Long Island. We'd be happy, once we can see what the price signal is, that's what we really need at that point. We can model it and we can make a decision. So, but, we're excited to look upstate New York, definitely.
You meant Indian Point, right?
What did I say?
3 Mile
Oh, yes, yeah, sorry about that, thank you, yeah.
We won't jinx you, Indian Point. You're fine. No, I think that's right. I mean, I really honestly think it comes down to being able to kind of get a better sense here of what we're going to expect in terms of revenue. So the devil's in the details for some of these, the CES details. So how these procurements go, what the price ends up to be for them, what's the signal? Are we going to continue with the signal about how that mandate's going to ramp up, or are we switching gears? So, is there a clear signal for the next couple of years to the market about where we're headed? I think that's all really important. And when you get into these, RPSs, clean energy standards, there's so many details, right? And I think another detail is the border issue, right? Imports and exports, and how does that end up playing up, in terms of NYSERDA and NYPA's procurements and private transactions, what's being wheeled up from PJM or Canada versus what's coming from in-state, and how are our borders working? How is that all playing together? We're very excited to engage further on those details and to see more of that really drive towards the state and stakeholder goals.
Great, and Michael,
I'd like to just offer my perspective. Yep. I think when I think about where we're at, our role is in these turbulent times is to provide some certainty. And that's exactly what the ISO is trying to do through its DER roadmap. We put out a 5-year plan and we intend to hit it. We're also now working on a similar plan for storage. Hopefully that will come out in the next couple of days or a week. And again, it'll be a multi-year plan and we're going to hit it. And the purpose of that is to provide the marketplace with certainty on where we're headed. And I think that will pay dividends in the success of us achieving these goals.
Well, actually, we just have about 15 seconds left, so I think I'm going to leave it off on that. please everyone find our panelists after this and continue the discussions, and thank you all for a wonderful conversation up here.
Thank you.